Kentucky churches came together for a safety and security conference today. As WKYT's Alyssa Williams shows us, they're working to prepare their congregations for any potential threats or emergencies that could come their way. When church is in session and things like severe weather, a medical emergency, or even an active shooting takes place, who's there to help before emergency services arrive? That's where safety and security teams step in.
Most of us don't feel like we have a gift. We can't sing, we can't do a lot of things, but then we realize that, hey, maybe our gift is the safety or security teams.
Dozens of church members from across the Commonwealth gathered at Clays Mill Baptist Church in Nicholasville to learn more on how they can keep their congregations safer.
Really boils down to three things: ready, willing, and able.
The conference was hosted by 4 Kentucky churches and the Faith-Based Security Network, whose founder, Carl Chin, started the organization after his own safety was compromised.
I became a hostage in a violent gun incident at Focus on the Family on May 2nd of 1996. After that, I started speaking to other ministries and churches about getting ready, having an intentional program.
Chin would later survive a shooting at his church in 2007, further proving the importance of a safety team.
I was the team leader one day when a killer came in, killed 2 girls in the parking lot, and we responded to the hallway where he came in shooting, and were able to stop him with firearms.
Whether someone faces a heart attack or a gunshot wound, the main message of these conferences:
don't fall into the trap of it can't happen here.
In Nicholasville, Alyssa Williams, WKYT. Many of those safety teams are made up of former and current law enforcement or medical professionals.